When the Germans entered Paris on the morning of June 14, 1940, they did not arrive to fanfare or resistance. They rolled in quietly, columns of motorcycles, armored cars, and troops advancing down boulevards that just days earlier had been choked with terrified refugees. The City of Light, once the heartbeat of Europe, was suddenly mute. For weeks, rumors had flooded the French capital. First, that the Maginot Line was holding. Then, that the Germans had crossed the Meuse. Then, that Paris itself would be declared an open city. By the time General von Küchler's 18th Army reached its outskirts, most of the French government had fled south, leaving behind 1 million citizens and a vacuum of power. The night before, Paris went dark, literally. In a city famed for its brilliance, every streetlight, every shop sign, every café lamp was ordered extinguished. Anti-aircraft guns were silent. Police had orders not to resist. Bridges over the Seine were mined, but no one gave the order to detonate. The mayor of Paris, Pierre Taillinger, met with German officers in the Hôtel de Ville and formally surrendered the city. By dawn, the tricolor flags were being quietly taken down. By noon, the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. For many Parisians, the war ended that morning, and a different kind of survival began. The fall of Paris didn't come as a single event. It came as a slow suffocation. In late May 1940, as German panzers broke through the Ardennes, millions of civilians began fleeing southward. The roads out of Paris clogged with carts, bicycles, cars running out of petrol, and people carrying mattresses on their backs. They called it l'exode, the exodus. Among the crowds were teachers, bakers, and artists' families pushing prams next to livestock. Old men with medals from the last war trudged beside barefoot children. It was the largest migration in French history, an entire population on the move, heading nowhere. By June 10th, the Blix government itself was gone. The Chamber of Deputies, the ministries, even the Bank of France, packed up and left for Tours, then Bordeaux. Only a few officials remained behind to manage what would become occupied France. In those final days before the Germans entered, Paris was a ghost city. No trams, no newspapers, no trains leaving the Gare de Lyon. The Louvre had been emptied, its masterpieces hidden in castles across the countryside. The Mona Lisa traveled in a padded crate, under military guard, disguised as a shipment of potatoes. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers brought back from the front. Food was scarce, gasoline non-existent. Bread lines stretched along the Seine, and rumors spread faster than truth. Some believed the British would bomb the city to deny it to the Germans. Others believed the French army would blow up the bridges. But when the morning came, nothing happened. Paris surrendered without a fight. The first German troops entered through the Porte de la Chapelle at dawn. Witnesses remember them marching in perfect silence, boots echoing on cobblestones, rifles gleaming in the pale light. Bystanders, mostly elderly or too poor to flee, watched from behind curtains. One woman, a seamstress from Montmartre, later recalled, "They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like tourists. They stopped at cafes, they smiled, they took photographs of the opera." By mid-morning, German patrols were stationed at every major intersection. Tanks idled beneath the Arc de Triomphe. At Place de la Concorde, soldiers posed for photographs, beside statues draped in camouflage netting. Loudspeakers announced in German and French that curfew would begin at 9 p.m. All firearms must be surrendered, and anyone aiding British troops or enemies of the Reich would be shot. Yet, beneath the fear, there was also relief. The bombings had stopped. The city had been spared destruction. Many Parisians convinced themselves this was temporary, that France would reorganize, negotiate, and the Germans would leave. Few understood this was not an occupation of weeks, but of years. Within days, German administrators moved into Parisian ministries and hotels. The Hotel Majestic became the headquarters of the German military command in France, Militärbefehlshaber in Frankreich. The Hotel Lutetia once a luxury residence for artists and intellectuals, became a Nazi intelligence center. Signs appeared overnight. Nur für Deutsche, only for Germans. Défense de parler. Aux soldats allemands. Forbidden to speak to German soldiers. German currency flooded the economy, replacing francs with occupation scrip. Cafe owners had to hang price lists in both languages. A coffee that cost 2 francs now cost 10. The population of Paris shrank to half its pre-war size, from nearly 3 million to just 1.5 million people. Those who stayed behind lived in a city split in two, one visible, one hidden. By day, the boulevards filled with German uniforms and French civilians pretending life went on. By night, resistance leaflets appeared on lampposts, and whispers spread through the metro tunnels. Every gesture mattered. Speaking too loudly in a cafe could mean arrest. Smiling at a German could mean collaboration. A missing friend could mean deportation. Paris became a theater of masks. By autumn 1940, the city's electricity was rationed. Whole districts went dark after sundown. Cinemas were restricted, and newspapers printed under censorship. The once lively Montparnasse and Saint-Germain quarters, home to writers and painters, fell silent. The curfew was absolute. Anyone caught outside after 9 p.m. could be arrested or shot on sight. Only police, firemen, and German patrols moved through the streets after dark. Those who remember it said the city smelled of coal smoke, cheap wine, and fear. In cafes, people lowered their voices. Jazz, deemed degenerate by Nazi ideology, was banned, but it played quietly in basements anyway. Artists like Django Reinhardt and Josephine Baker were under surveillance. Baker fled to the Free Zone, later joining the French resistance as a spy. Food shortages were constant. Butter, meat, coffee, and sugar disappeared first. People queued for hours for thin bread or watery soup. The rationing system divided the population into categories: workers, children, the elderly, each receiving coupons barely enough to survive. Cigarettes became currency, so did soap. On the black market, an egg could cost a day's wages. Those with connections, especially those willing to trade or flatter German officers, lived better. Restaurants like Maxim's and La Coupole stayed open, filled with uniforms and laughter. Outside, Parisians walked past with empty stomachs and empty eyes. The occupation blurred every line between right and wrong, resistance and survival. Some Parisians collaborated openly, whether out of ideology or opportunity. Journalists joined German propaganda offices. Police officers enforced German orders. Even artists desperate to work adapted. Fashion designer Coco Chanel reopened her boutique at the Ritz, where German officers stayed. The cinema industry thrived under German approval, churning out escapist films that distracted from hunger and fear. But for others, collaboration was a death sentence, morally or literally. Neighbors disappeared overnight. The Gestapo operated from the Hotel Continental, arresting anyone suspected of aiding the enemy. The prisons at Fresnay and La Santé filled with political detainees. Whispers spread of torture, of trains leaving from Gare de l'Est heading east. No one yet knew what Auschwitz meant, but everyone knew not to ask too loudly. In October 1940, a group of students from the Sorbonne printed leaflets denouncing the occupation. They called themselves Les Petites Ailes, the Little Wings. Their tools: a typewriter, a mimeograph, and courage. Others followed: postal workers sabotaging letters, railwaymen delaying trains, teachers hiding forbidden maps of France that still included Alsace-Lorraine. But resistance was not yet an army. It was a whisper, a refusal to listen to the BBC in secret, to paint V for victory on a wall at night, to refuse to salute the German patrols. Every act of defiance was small and dangerous. When German soldiers began being shot in 1941, the reprisals were brutal. Hostages were executed publicly at Mont Valérien. Posters appeared with lists of names shot in retaliation for acts of terrorism. The city's fear deepened. but so did its quiet defiance. Not all stories of occupation are of hatred. Some are of impossible love. German officers, cultured, polite, often fluent in French, began courting Parisian women. Some relationships were genuine, others transactional. By 1942, more than 85,000 horizontal collaborations had been reported. It was a scandal that would outlive the war. After liberation, women accused of consorting with Germans were paraded through the streets, their heads shaved, their humiliation public. But during the occupation, these relationships often meant food, protection, survival. Morality was a luxury not everyone could afford. Even in silence, Paris refused to stop being Paris. Writers met in secret salons, artists painted by candlelight, and musicians found ways to play forbidden notes. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote his first plays under censorship. Simone de Beauvoir lectured on philosophy at the Lycée Carnot. Picasso, banned from exhibiting, painted in defiance the great still life with Steer's skull, hung in his studio as both symbol and warning. In a city of occupation, creation itself became rebellion. By late 1941, a bitter rhythm had taken hold. Parisians learned to navigate two worlds, the occupied and the hidden. The Germans lived in grand hotels, attended the opera, and dined on black market delicacies. The French queued for bread, whispered in alleys, and tried to forget the sound of marching boots. And through it all, Paris, once called the City of Light, glowed faintly, stubbornly, beneath the blackout curtains. When Paris fell silent under German boots, another kind of machinery began to hum, quiet at first, almost invisible. It wasn't made of steel or engines, but of paper, offices, lists, and fear. The German military command in France, based at the Hotel Majestic, began reorganizing the city not as a battlefield, but as an administrative organism. Every street, every bakery, every police precinct became a cog in a vast system of occupation. It was order born from chaos, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. On paper, France was divided into two zones: the occupied zone, which included Paris, and northern France, under direct German control. The free zone, administered by Marshal Philippe Pétain's government in Vichy, supposedly autonomous, but in reality, little more than a client state. In practice, the boundary meant little. German intelligence reached everywhere. But in Paris, the occupation was absolute. The city was governed by General Otto von Stumpnagel, a veteran of the First World War, who presented himself as the protector of French culture. He assured the French people that as long as they obeyed, life could continue normally. But beneath that veneer of civility, the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, was already embedding itself. The Hotel Lutetia became their nerve center, the Hotel Bristol, their residence. At night, trucks with blacked-out windows idled on Rue des Saussayes, outside the Gestapo offices. Inside, interrogations began, screams muffled by the thick stone walls. The machinery of control was no longer invisible. It was everywhere. The occupation didn't rely solely on German soldiers. It relied on French police. Almost immediately, the Germans discovered that Paris's police system was one of the most organized in Europe, and they used it. The French prefecture of police, under René Bousquet and later Pierre Laval, began collaborating with German authorities to maintain order and root out subversion. That meant one thing: lists. Every citizen had to carry identity papers. Jews had to declare themselves and register at their local commissariat. At first, many didn't believe it mattered. France had always been a republic: equality, liberty, fraternity. But by 1941, registration became a trap. Police raids began at dawn, with names called from lists typed neatly on German typewriters but compiled by French hands. The first Jews arrested in Paris weren't foreign. They were French citizens, doctors, shopkeepers, school teachers. Most were sent to the Drancy internment camp, a converted apartment complex north of Paris, guarded by French gendarmes. From there, they vanished eastward. Down south, in the spa town of Vichy, Marshal Philippe Pétain had declared himself head of the French state. He was 84 years old, a hero of Verdun, now the face of submission. His regime promised work, family, fatherland, replacing the old republican motto of liberty, equality, fraternity. In Paris, that meant censorship, propaganda, and the systematic rewriting of loyalty. Newspapers printed daily photos of Pétain shaking hands with German officers, calling for obedience. French radio broadcast speeches condemning terrorists, meaning resistance fighters. For the elderly who remembered Verdun, Pétain was still the savior of France. For the young, he was the symbol of its betrayal. But his shadow stretched across every occupied street, legitimizing the collaboration that made the German grip unbreakable. Every cafe, bakery, and factory in Paris was forced to adapt to the new economic reality. France worked for Germany. The Germans imposed massive occupation costs, 500 million francs per day, paid by the French government to support the occupying army. The result was catastrophic inflation. Factories that once built cars now repaired German trucks. Textile mills produced Wehrmacht uniforms. Even the great department stores, Printemps, Galeries, Lafayette, stayed open. But their best goods were reserved for Germans. The black market became the lifeline of Paris. In the covered alleys of Les Halles, one could find contraband, butter, cigarettes, even meat, if one had money or favors to trade. German soldiers often looked the other way. Some participated, but for the average Parisian, the city was divided between those who ate and those who starved. The Germans didn't need to crush the French spirit with bombs. Hunger did the work for them. Occupation isn't just physical, it's psychological. And no one understood that better than Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda. Under his direction, German authorities in Paris controlled every form of communication: newspapers, radio, film, even posters. The once boisterous Le Figaro and Le Matin became mouthpieces of collaboration, publishing articles about Franco-German friendship. Billboards proclaimed, "L'Europe nouvelle est en marche." A new Europe is marching forward. At the same time, they banned news of resistance, executions, or deportations. But propaganda was most dangerous when it came wrapped in entertainment. Cinemas reopened under German approval, showing films that romanticized order and discouraged rebellion. The French film Le Corbeau, produced in 1943 under Nazi oversight, depicted a town destroyed by rumor and distrust, a subtle message that resistance would only bring chaos. Yet paradoxically, these same venues became gathering places for the underground. Leaflets were slipped between theater seats. Sabotage messages were whispered during intermissions. Even propaganda could not suppress curiosity. In Paris, silence was never total. By late 1941, the Gestapo had infiltrated nearly every neighborhood. They relied on informants, concierges, shopkeepers, even priests, anyone willing to trade information for safety or favor. A careless word in a cafe could mean arrest. A letter intercepted at the post office could mean deportation. The Gestapo's power lay not just in violence, but in uncertainty. Their arrests were selective, unpredictable. Sometimes they took known resistance members, sometimes they took random citizens. The message was simple: no one is safe. One of their main prisons, the Fresnes prison, became a black hole of the occupation. Prisoners were interrogated for days, sometimes weeks. Few emerged without scars, physical or otherwise. Across the Seine, the Hotel Continental was reserved for high-value prisoners, generals, politicians, intellectuals. Many were tortured, others bribed, some quietly executed and buried outside the city. But the Gestapo also made mistakes. Every arrest, every interrogation left traces, and those traces began to connect the threads of resistance. Until 1941, resistance was fragmented small circles of students, ex-soldiers, communists, and nationalists working independently. But as repression grew, so did coordination. Groups began to merge into movements. Combat, led by Henri Frenay. Libération Nord, founded by Christian Pinot. Franc-Tireur, operating from Lyon, but with networks reaching Paris. Their work was meticulous and invisible, forging documents, printing newspapers, helping downed Allied pilots escape to Spain. By 1942, underground presses in Paris printed nearly 300,000 copies of banned newspapers every week, produced in cellars, distributed by bicycle, read in secret. The French resistance had no uniforms, no insignia, but it had courage. One resistance fighter, Lucie Aubrac, described it simply, "We fought with ink before we fought with guns." The Brecht machinery of control reached its most terrifying efficiency in 1942. That summer, the Germans demanded mass arrests of Jews, including women and children. The order came from Berlin, but it was executed by French police. On July 16th and 17th, over 13,000 Jews were rounded up in Paris. Most were taken to the Vélodrome de Hiver, a covered cycling stadium near the Eiffel Tower. They were locked inside for days without food or water, the summer heat suffocating, the air thick with the smell of urine and fear. From there, trains took them to Drancy, then to Auschwitz. Only a few hundred survived. The operation known today as the Rafle du Vel de Hiver remains one of the darkest chapters in French history. What shocked many Parisians was not only the brutality, but the realization that the men carrying the batons wore French uniforms. For the first time, collaboration could no longer be disguised as obedience. It was complicity. Even as arrests multiplied, Paris's cultural heart kept beating quietly. Pablo Picasso, still living in his Montmartre studio, refused to leave. When Gestapo officers searched his apartment and found photographs of Guernica, one asked, "Did you do this?" Picasso replied, "No, you did." Writers like Albert Camus joined the underground press, publishing essays under pseudonyms. In 1942, Camus released The Stranger, a novel about alienation under tyranny, its publication itself an act of resistance. Even fashion, absurd as it seemed, became symbolic defiance. Parisian women, forbidden from wearing extravagant clothing, responded with creativity, as protest colorful scarves, handmade hats, improvised elegance. They called it La Couture de Guerre War fashion, a reminder that even under occupation, the French refused to surrender their identity. By late 1942, the balance of power began to shift. The Allies landed in North Africa, in Operation Torch, bringing American and Free French forces into the war. Hitler responded by occupying what was left of Free France, eliminating the illusion of the Vichy zone. Now, all of France was under direct German control. In Paris, the atmosphere darkened further. Deportations increased, curfews tightened, but whispers of hope began spreading rumors of Allied advances, of a second front. BBC broadcasts in French carried coded messages. Jean a une longue moustache. Les carottes sont cuites. Each phrase meant something to the underground sabotage tonight. Arms dropped tomorrow. The city began to wake up. By 1943, many Parisians lived dual identities. A bank clerk by day might print fake documents by night. A cafe waitress could be a courier for the resistance. A priest could hide fugitives in the crypt. The occupiers saw normalcy. Beneath it was a second France hidden, watchful, waiting. But double lives came at a price. The Gestapo's network of informants tightened. Betrayals became common. Whole cells were dismantled overnight. Torture, executions, and public hangings at Mont Valérien became grim spectacles meant to break morale. Still, the underground refused to die. As one fighter wrote in a secret journal, "We learned to live like ghosts, because ghosts are hard to kill." Even in resistance, Paris kept its rhythm. Hidden jazz clubs played In the Mood behind closed curtains. German officers, unaware or pretending not to notice, often drank there too. Music became a strange truce, a shared illusion of peace amid war. One young trumpeter, caught playing an American tune, was arrested and beaten. But when released weeks later, he went straight back to the club and played again. His reason? Because silence is surrender. By 1944, the machinery of control that had seemed invincible began to rust. The Germans were still in Paris, but their confidence was gone. The resistance was no longer scattered, it was a network. And somewhere in London, a man named Charles de Gaulle was preparing to speak again. The city that had once gone dark was about to reignite. By early 1944, the occupation of Paris had entered its fourth year. The city had adapted to darkness, ration cards, curfews, and whispers had become routine. But beneath that routine, something was changing. The fear that had paralyzed the city was hardening into resolve. It began quietly with rumors. Rumors that the Allies were coming, that the Germans were retreating, that de Gaulle, the voice once heard from London, would soon return. Each rumor was a spark. And in a city smothered by fear, sparks were dangerous things. By now, the French resistance was no longer a collection of scattered circles. It was an underground army. Dozens of groups had coalesced into larger organizations, each with its own mission: sabotage, intelligence, propaganda, or assassination. Among the most powerful were the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, the umbrella that united fighters from all political factions; the FTP, Francs Tireurs et Partisans, communist-led, fierce, and uncompromising; combat Gaullist, loyal to de Gaulle and focused on coordination with the Allies; Liberation Nord and Défense de la France, the major underground presses. Their members were teachers, shopkeepers, engineers, students, even priests. They forged papers, blew up rail lines, and gathered intelligence on troop movements, often with nothing more than bicycles, typewriters, and courage. In occupied Paris, some of the bravest fighters didn't carry guns, they carried shopping baskets. Women played a decisive, often overlooked role in the resistance. They were couriers, spies, radio operators, and protectors. Their gender gave them camouflage. German patrols were less likely to suspect a young mother with groceries than a man with a briefcase. Lucy Aubrac, a schoolteacher turned revolutionary, orchestrated the daring escape of her husband from a Gestapo convoy. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, leader of the Alliance Network, ran one of the largest intelligence operations in France, her code name, Hedgehog. Bertie Albrecht, founder of Combat, was tortured to death by the Gestapo but refused to betray her comrades. Their weapons were forged not in factories, but in willpower. While the Germans filled Parisian airwaves with propaganda, another voice pierced through the static, the BBC's Radio Londres. Each night, Parisians gathered around hidden radios, shutters closed, ears pressed close to catch the faint transmission from across the channel. The broadcast began with the sound of 4 drumbeats, the Morse code for V for victory. Then came the voice: Ici Londres. Les Français parlent au Français. This is London. The French are speaking to the French. It was forbidden to listen, punishable by prison or death, but they listened anyway. The messages were often cryptic. The crow sings at midnight. Jean has a long mustache. Each phrase carried a coded meaning for resistance, networks' orders for sabotage, signals for parachute drops, warnings of raids, and sometimes they carried something more powerful than any order: hope. The war of words turned into a war of wires. Resistance saboteurs targeted railways, bridges, telegraph lines, anything that kept the German war machine moving. By the spring of 1944, sabotage had become a daily occurrence. In the railway yards of Ivry and Saint-Denis, explosions derailed German supply trains. At Renault's factories on the Seine, workers staged slowdowns, producing faulty parts for German tanks. The Germans responded with fury. For every train destroyed, hostages were shot. For every officer killed, prisoners were executed at Mont-Valérien. Public posters appeared: 50 hostages executed in reprisal for attacks on the German army. But instead of terrorizing Parisians into submission, the reprisals had the opposite effect. The cruelty made the occupation's mask of civility impossible to believe. Every new execution only deepened the city's resolve. While fighters risked their lives underground, Paris's artists waged their own rebellion in the open. Painters, writers, and actors defied censorship with allegory. Jean-Paul Sartre's play *The Flies* reimagined Greek myth as a metaphor for collaboration and guilt. The audience understood perfectly. Albert Camus' letters to a German friend circulated secretly in typed pamphlets, arguing that freedom is not a gift, but a conquest. Art became resistance. To write, to paint, to play music was to insist, we are still human. Then came June 6, 1944, Le Jour J. At dawn, BBC radios crackled with extraordinary news. Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The long-awaited invasion had begun. In Paris, people wept in secret. They smiled at strangers. They whispered, "It has started." German propaganda tried to downplay the invasion, calling it a minor attack. But Parisians knew. They could hear the distant rumble of bombers at night, see the nervousness in German patrols, feel the pulse of history quicken. Resistance networks sprang into action. Sabotage intensified, bridges blown, train lines cut, telephone cables severed. The Allies were moving inland, and the underground was determined to paralyze the German retreat. The Gestapo responded with mass arrests. Thousands were deported in the final months, many never returned. But even as the net tightened, hope had become unstoppable. Summer 1944 was like no other in living memory. Paris was still occupied, but the occupation was fraying. German soldiers no longer marched with confidence. Their once proud uniforms were faded, their eyes hollow. The Red Army was advancing in the east, the Americans were in Normandy, and Allied planes roared overhead almost daily. The black market thrived partly from desperation, partly from celebration. Rumors of liberation filled cafes and basements alike. But with hope came danger. As Allied troops drew closer, Hitler ordered Paris to be held at all costs. If it could not be held, it was to be destroyed. The command went to General Dietrich von Choltitz, the newly appointed military governor. He was handed a chilling order. Paris must not fall into enemy hands, or, if it does, only as a field of rubble. On August 10, 1944, Paris exploded. It began with a strike. Railway workers at Gare de l'Est refused to operate trains. Then postal workers, police, and metro employees joined in. Within days, the entire city was on strike. Barricades appeared overnight, wooden carts, furniture, even pianos dragged into the streets. The tricolor flag, banned for 4 years, reappeared from windows. The resistance was no longer hiding. It was fighting. On August 19th, the FFI seized the prefecture of police on Ile de la Cité, raising the French flag for the first time since 1940. Gunfire erupted across the city. Snipers fired from rooftops. Tanks patrolled the boulevards. Ordinary citizens joined the fight with hunting rifles, pistols, or whatever they could find. The uprising had begun. The battle for Paris lasted less than a week, but it burned like a century. The resistance held key buildings, the Hôtel de Ville, the police headquarters, the printing presses. German forces counterattacked fiercely. Streets became killing zones. Civilians carried messages under fire. Medics turned bakeries into makeshift hospitals. The Red Cross estimated more than 1,500 Parisians killed in the fighting. Still, the uprising held. Inside the Hotel Meurice, General von Choltitz received frantic orders from Berlin, demanding the destruction of the city. Bridges were wired with explosives. Gasoline drums placed under monuments, the Eiffel Tower, Notre-Dame, the Louvre, all rigged to burn. But Choltitz hesitated. He had seen Warsaw's destruction. He knew it was madness. In the early hours of August 25, 1944, the question echoed across German phone lines. Brent Paris? Is Paris burning? It wasn't. That morning, American tanks of the 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, along with Free French forces, rolled into the city from the south. Crowds poured into the streets, weeping, cheering, throwing flowers. At the Hôtel de Ville, Leclerc embraced resistance leader Henri Roll-Tanguy, a communist colonel sealing the unity of Free France and the underground. By noon, von Choltitz surrendered. He handed over his pistol and declared, "I have not destroyed Paris because I do not wish to go down in history as the man who did." Hours later, the bells of Notre-Dame rang for the first time in 4 years. On August 26, General Charles de Gaulle entered Paris through the Porte d'Orléans, greeted by a city that had not seen its own flag fly freely since 1940. He marched on foot down the Champs-Élysées, through a sea of millions, shouting, crying, waving tricolors. German snipers fired from rooftops, but he did not flinch. Reporters asked if he feared being shot. He replied, "No, the bullets are French too." That evening, at the Hôtel de Ville, de Gaulle delivered a speech that would define post-war France. Paris! Paris outraged! Paris broken! Paris martyred! But Paris liberated. Liberated by itself. Liberated by its people. With the help of the armies of France, with the support and the help of all France. The crowd roared. For 4 years, the city had lived in silence. Now, its voice returned with thunder. Liberation brought euphoria and reckoning. Within days, acts of revenge spread through the city. Collaborators were hunted down. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers, the collaboratrices, horizontals, were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved, their humiliation public. Thousands were arrested, some executed without trial. In the chaos, innocence and guilt blurred once again. De Gaulle demanded restraint. France, he said, must rise, not fall again into vengeance. But the scars were deep. More than 70,000 Parisians had been deported during the occupation. Only a fraction returned. Among them were the survivors of Drancy, skeletal and silent, walking through a city that no longer knew them. The cafes reopened, the lights returned, but the city was changed forever. In the months after liberation, Paris became the world's capital once more, of art, of politics, of rebirth. American jazz returned to smoky bars. Picasso unveiled new works. Writers who had survived the war, Camus, Sartre, Beauvoir, debated the moral meaning of freedom and guilt. But beneath the laughter and music, a shadow remained. Every bridge, every monument, every cobblestone still whispered of the occupation, the hunger, the whispers, the fear. And yet the city lived. Because in the end, Paris always lives. 4 years earlier, when the Germans first marched in, Parisians had watched in silence as their flag came down. Now, in August 1944, they watched it rise again, over the same rooftops, the same bridges, the same Seine. It fluttered in the wind, reflected in the river below. The lights came back on. The cafes filled again. The bells of Notre-Dame rang freely. And for the first time in 4 long years, the people of Paris could finally breathe, speak, sing, and remember. Because even when the lights went out, Paris had never stopped shining. In the first weeks after liberation, chaos ruled the streets. The Germans were gone, but order had not yet returned. Police forces were shattered, and tempers burned with 4 years of humiliation. Between August and October 1944, France experienced what historians now call l'épuration sauvage, the wild purge. Across Paris, mobs formed to take justice into their own hands. Men, accused of collaboration, were dragged from their homes. Women, accused of sleeping with Germans, les femmes tendues, were paraded through the streets, heads shaved, faces smeared with tar. There were thousands of them. Some were guilty informants, mistresses of Gestapo officers. Others were simply victims of gossip, jealousy, or revenge. A photograph by Robert Capa, taken in Chartres, captured the horror perfectly. A young mother, her head shaven, clutching her baby, being marched through the crowd, her crime loving a German soldier. In Paris, scenes like that played out daily. The humiliation was meant to cleanse France's shame, but it also revealed it. The thirst for vengeance didn't stop with humiliation. Executions became common. Across the country, an estimated 9,000 people were killed without trial, shot by resistance fighters, militias, or mobs. Some were Nazi collaborators, others merely suspected. In Paris, the courtyard of the Prefecture of Police, once a symbol of German control, became a place of retribution. Suspected traitors were lined up and shot by firing squads, their bodies left on display. One survivor of the resistance later admitted, "We wanted justice, but we didn't know what justice meant anymore. We had lived too long in the dark." When the chaos subsided, Charles de Gaulle imposed order. He understood that vengeance without law would tear France apart. On September 9, 1944, he established the Haute Cour de Justice, the High Court, to try collaborators formally. What followed was l'épuration légale, the legal purge. Over 300,000 investigations were launched. More than 120,000 people were brought to trial. Of these, around 6,700 were sentenced to death, though fewer than 800 executions were carried out. Among the condemned were journalists, politicians, industrialists, people who had prospered under occupation. One of the most infamous was Pierre Laval, former Prime Minister of Vichy France. Laval had collaborated openly, sending French workers to German factories and helping organize Jewish deportations. He was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad in October 1945. Another was Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aged hero of Verdun turned head of the Vichy regime. At his trial, he stood frail but defiant, declaring, "I gave France peace when it could have had war." He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. De Gaulle, unwilling to execute the old soldier of Verdun, commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Pétain was sent to a fortress on the Île d'Yeu, where he died in 1951, a hero turned ghost. As trials unfolded, another process began, quieter, more subtle, but just as powerful. France began to rewrite its own story. De Gaulle understood that to rebuild, the country needed pride, not guilt. He spoke not of collaboration, but of resistance. He declared that Paris liberated itself, with the help of Free France. It was true, but not the whole truth. In reality, the Allies had played a crucial role. American and British troops had supplied weapons, intelligence, and air support. And within France itself, millions had remained passive or complicit, too afraid to act. But de Gaulle's narrative served a purpose. It turned humiliation into heroism. It gave the French people something they desperately needed, a clean mirror to look into. Thus was born the myth of La France résistante, the France that had never truly surrendered. When the war ended, women emerged from the shadows in more ways than one. For years, they had carried messages, hidden fugitives, run printing presses, and smuggled arms, often without recognition. Now, they demanded their place in the new France. De Gaulle granted it. In April 1944, women were finally given the right to vote in France, a right they had been denied even before the war. In October 1945, French women cast their ballots for the first time in national elections. But the same streets that now saw women voting had, only months earlier, seen women humiliated for loving the enemy. It was a cruel irony. The nation that had used women to cleanse its shame now celebrated them as symbols of renewal. Still, many resisted bitterness. As one female fighter said simply, "We did what had to be done. That was enough." The liberation of Paris had been joyous but incomplete. Thousands were still missing. In 1945, the survivors of Nazi camps began to return. Trains arrived at Gare de l'Est, carrying skeletal figures wrapped in blankets. Their families barely recognized them. Some had no families left. The French word for déporté entered the national vocabulary. It carried no need for explanation. Everyone knew. The stories they told shattered what illusions remained. Of cattle cars, of barbed wire, of smoke rising from chimneys. Drancy, once dismissed as an internment camp, was revealed to have been the starting point of over 70,000 deportations to Auschwitz and Sobibor. Of those deported from France, fewer than 3,000 returned. For many Parisians, it was the first time they truly understood what collaboration had cost. From London, from Algiers, from the prisons of Germany, the exiles came home. Writers, soldiers, and exiled politicians returned to reclaim a country that no longer felt the same. Among them was Jean Moulin, or rather, his memory. Captured and tortured to death by the Gestapo in 1943, Moulin had united the resistance under de Gaulle's authority. In 1945, his ashes were ceremoniously transferred to the Panthéon, resting place of France's heroes. De Gaulle himself delivered the eulogy, his voice echoing beneath the dome. "Enter here, Jean Moulin, with your brothers in glory, with all those who died so that France might live." It was not only a tribute, it was a message. France would remember its heroes, not its traitors. The war had left France physically intact compared to Germany, but economically shattered. Factories had been stripped of machinery, rail lines destroyed, the currency worthless. Food shortages persisted well into 1946. Bread was rationed, coal was scarce, and winter was harsh. But for the first time in years, hunger came without humiliation. De Gaulle's provisional government set out to rebuild not just infrastructure, but identity. He nationalized industries that had profited under collaboration: Renault, Air France, major banks. He reformed education, healthcare, and welfare, laying the foundation for the modern French state. At the same time, he re-established France's global dignity. France would sit among the victors, not the vanquished, a founder of the United Nations, a power with its own occupation zone in Germany. To the world, it appeared as though France had emerged proud and unbroken. But inside, the scars were deep and unhealed. The liberation of Paris unleashed an explosion of creativity and confession. Artists and writers who had lived through occupation now turned their gaze inward. Albert Camus published La Peste, the Plague, a novel set in an Algerian city struck by disease, an allegory for life under tyranny. Jean-Paul Sartre's Les Mansales and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex questioned the moral foundations of freedom and identity. Filmmakers like René Clément and Marcel Carné turned the war's contradictions into stories: Le Silence de la Mer, Les Enfants du Paradis, films that captured both resistance and complicity. And in jazz clubs from Pigalle to Montparnasse, the music of survival returned: Django Reinhardt's guitar, Sidney Bechet's clarinet, American GIs dancing with Parisian girls. The City of Light had rediscovered its rhythm, but every note carried a trace of mourning. As time passed, another debate took hold, one that still divides historians today. Who truly liberated Paris? De Gaulle's version, Paris liberated by itself, with the help of Free France, became the official narrative. But the truth was more complex. The Allied forces, primarily the American 4th Infantry Division and the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, made the liberation possible. Without them, the uprising might have ended in massacre. The communist resistance, particularly the FFI and FTP units, played a decisive role in seizing buildings and maintaining control until Allied troops arrived. They wanted credit and political power in the new France. De Gaulle, wary of a communist uprising, rushed to Paris, not just to celebrate victory, but to claim it. His appearance at the Hôtel de Ville wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. It ensured that France's liberation looked French, even when it wasn't entirely so. But perhaps the truest answer lies somewhere else. Paris was liberated by its people, by the millions who endured hunger, silence, and fear, yet refused to let their city die. In the years that followed, France built memorials to heroes: de Gaulle, Moulin, the FFI, but spoke little of complicity. The collaboration of French police in Jewish deportations remained taboo until the 1972. In 1995, half a century later, President Jacques Chirac broke the silence. The criminal folly of the occupiers was seconded by the French state. France, that day, committed the irreparable. His admission shattered decades of denial. It also marked a turning point, the moment France truly began to reckon with its past. Today, the Paris of occupation exists only in photographs, soldiers at the Eiffel Tower, ration lines along the Seine, shadows beneath blackout curtains, but traces remain. Plaques mark the walls where resistance fighters fell. The Hotel Lutetia, once Gestapo headquarters, now stands as a luxury hotel again, yet its basement still carries the silence of interrogation rooms. Every July, the bells of Notre-Dame ring in memory of the day they rang free again. And each year, when the lights of Paris shine across the Seine, they shine on ghosts. Ghosts of a city that once lived 4 years without its own reflection. The occupation of Paris was not simply a military chapter, it was a moral one. It revealed how civilization can exist under tyranny, how beauty can coexist with cruelty, and how survival itself can become a form of resistance. Some fought with guns, some fought with words, some fought simply by enduring, but all, in their own way, kept the flame alive. When the lights went out, Paris did not die. It waited patiently, defiantly, for the moment it could shine again. And when it did, the glow was not just electric, it was human. When the guns fell silent in 1945, France began to speak again, but what it said, and what it didn't, would shape generations to come. The liberation had ended the war. It had not ended the memory. Paris was free, but the ghosts of occupation lingered in its streets, invisible in daylight, undeniable at night. The war had divided the nation, not just between collaborators and resistors, but between those who remembered and those who preferred to forget. And in the years that followed, forgetting became a national art. In the decade after liberation, France entered what historians call les années de silence, the years of silence. Between 1945 and 1955, public conversation about collaboration, deportations, or Jewish persecution was almost non-existent. It wasn't denial born of ignorance, it was exhaustion. The wounds were too fresh, the guilt too heavy, and the need to rebuild too urgent. De Gaulle's official narrative that France had resisted, suffered, and ultimately triumphed offered emotional shelter. It allowed the French to rebuild without drowning in shame. For a generation, the myth of une France résistante, the resisting France, prevailed. Children learned about Jean Moulin, the Maquis, the bravery of Free France. They did not learn about Drancy, the Vel d'Hiv, or the French policemen who filled the deportation trains. It was not yet time for truth. Cinema became one of the first tools of reconstruction, not of buildings, but of national identity. In the late 1940s, French films celebrated courage and unity. René Clément's La Bataille du Râle, 1946, portrayed railway workers sabotaging German trains, every Frenchman a hero, every act a defiance. It won awards at Cannes and reassured the country of its moral strength. But these films were as much therapy as history. They showed the France people wanted to remember, not the one they had lived. For nearly 20 years, French cinema avoided the gray zones, the compromises, the betrayals, the silence of good people doing nothing. Until the 1960 seconds, collaboration was a ghost that lived off-screen. By the 1960 seconds, a new generation came of age. One that had not lived through the occupation, but had grown up in its shadow. They began to ask questions their parents wouldn't answer. Questions about what France really did between 1940 and 1944, about how a republic of liberty and equality had allowed deportation lists to be typed in its own police stations. They were the children of silence, and they refused to inherit it. Historians like Robert Paxton, an American scholar, shattered the comfortable myth in the 1970 seconds with his book Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order. Paxton proved, through archival evidence, that the Vichy government did not simply obey German orders, it often went further, initiating anti-Jewish policies on its own. His work stunned France. For decades, the story had been one of victimhood. Now, it was one of responsibility. The debate divided the nation. Some accused Paxton of slander. Others called it liberation through truth. But the silence was finally breaking. Art again led the way into forbidden memory. In 1969, Marcel Aufus released Le Chagrin et la Pitié, Sorrow and the Pity, a 4-hour documentary that destroyed the myth of a nation united in resistance. Through interviews with ordinary French citizens from Clermont-Ferrand, the film revealed the complexity of life under occupation, collaboration, cowardice, quiet survival, and rare courage. French television refused to air it for over a decade. It was too raw, too honest, too soon. But audiences abroad saw it, and once seen, it could not be unseen. By the 1980 seconds, a new wave of French films began confronting the past directly. Lacombe, Lucien, 1974, Louis Mallet's story of a young Frenchman who joins the Gestapo by chance. Au revoir les enfants, 1987, his later masterpiece depicting schoolchildren betrayed during the Holocaust. Shoah, 1985, Claude Lanzmann's monumental 9.5-hour documentary of survivor testimony, filmed without a single archival image, only faces, places, and memory. Through these works, France began to look into its mirror again, and this time, it did not look away. By the late 20th century, memory itself had become political. Presidents could no longer speak of the war without addressing collaboration. Each tried to define France's role in his own way. De Gaulle had chosen myth to unify. Pompidou had chosen forgiveness to move forward. Mitterrand chose ambiguity. He honored resistance martyrs but kept silent about Vichy's crimes. It wasn't until Jacques Chirac's speech on July 16, 1995, at the Memorial for the Vel d'Hiv Roundup, that France's silence officially ended. Standing where French police once rounded up Jewish families, Chirac said, "Yes, the criminal folly of the occupiers was seconded by the French state. France, that day, committed the irreparable." It was the first time a French head of state publicly accepted national responsibility for the Holocaust. The words were heavy, but they lifted a weight carried for 50 years. The confrontation with the past did not weaken France. It made it honest. Out of guilt grew vigilance, a determination that such betrayal would never happen again. The study of occupation, resistance, and collaboration became mandatory in schools. Memorials rose where silence once stood. The Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, the preserved barracks at Drancy, the plaques on school walls, listing children deported and never returned. Each inscription began the same way: à la mémoire des enfants, to the memory of the children. The city that once whispered now spoke in bronze. During the Cold War, the legacy of occupation shaped politics in subtler ways. De Gaulle's mistrust of foreign domination, his insistence that France remain independent even from allies, was born from 1940. The memory of defeat and occupation made France wary of dependence on any superpower, American or Soviet. That trauma also fueled European integration. The creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to today's European Union, was designed to make another Franco-German war impossible. Europe, one diplomat said, was our peace treaty with history. Even French existentialism, the philosophy of Sartre and Beauvoir, carried echoes of the occupation. Freedom as responsibility, choice as moral weight, existence defined by action. Because in those years of darkness, doing nothing had been the worst crime of all. But not all ghosts faded easily. Even into the 2000s, legal and moral reckonings continued. In 1998, Maurice Papin, a former Vichy official, was convicted for his role in the deportation of Jews from Bordeaux. He was 87 years old. It took more than half a century for his crimes to meet justice. Each new trial reopened wounds. Each confession redefined guilt. For survivors, justice was never enough. But for the younger generations, it was a reminder that history is never truly past. It waits, quietly, for us to face it. Walk through Paris today, and you can read the war on its walls. Small brass plaques mark schools, police stations, courtyards. Here on this site, such and such a number of Jews were arrested by order of the German occupiers, with the help of the Vichy regime. Some Parisians pass without noticing. Others stop, touch the name, and whisper a prayer. The Hotel Lutetia, once Gestapo headquarters, reopened in 2018 as a 5-star hotel. In its lobby, a discreet plaque honors the deportees who passed through its basement cells. Luxury above, horror below, a metaphor for the city itself. At the Mémorial des Martyrs de la Déportation, near Notre-Dame, narrow corridors and dim lights create a claustrophobic echo of the camps. The walls are lined with 200,000 glass crystals, each symbolizing a life extinguished. The design is intentional. It doesn't let you escape without reflection. Modern Paris has transformed its boulevards, filled with tourists, its cafes alive, its skyline glittering again. But the city's modern rhythm carries an undertone, the knowledge that it once went silent, once starved, once disappeared into fear. That silence, paradoxically, is what gives Paris its music today. The laughter in Montmartre, the lights on the Seine, the freedom of lovers walking hand in hand at night, they all mean something, because once they were forbidden. When you sit on a terrace near Saint-Germain and hear the faint toll of church bells, you're hearing history breathe. Every ring echoes the bells of August 25th, 1944, when Paris was reborn. France's reckoning with occupation turned it into one of the world's most vocal defenders of human rights. The memory of complicity became a compass. The lesson of silence became policy. When wars erupted elsewhere, Bosnia, Rwanda, Ukraine, French journalists, historians, and politicians often invoked their own past. We know what happens when good people stay silent. The occupation gave France not only scars, but moral sight. Beyond politics and philosophy, the occupation left something deeply human, a collective understanding of fragility. Parisians learned how easily civilization can crumble, how neighbors can become enemies, how decency depends not on laws, but on choices made quietly, every day. And they learned, too, how quickly life returns. In the summer of 1945, children once again played along the Seine, lovers strolled by the Louvre, cafes reopened their terraces. The city healed not through monuments or speeches, but through ordinary living, through bread, music, laughter. Paris's greatest act of defiance was not its uprising. It was its return to joy. When the lights went out in Paris, the world lost more than a city. It lost its mirror. For 4 years, the City of Light showed what happens when art, beauty, and intellect are forced to kneel before fear. But when those lights came back on, the same city proved something else, that no tyranny, however total, can extinguish the human will to be free. From the blackout of 1940 to the bells of 1944, Paris lived both extremes of the 20th century: despair and rebirth, cruelty and compassion, silence and song. Its people emerged not innocent, but wiser, because survival is never pure. It is messy, compromised, human, and yet, within that imperfection lies endurance. When we walk Paris today past the Seine, the bridges, the cafes, we walk on history's tightrope. Below is the memory of darkness. Above, the promise of light. The city's beauty is not just in its art or architecture. It's in its capacity to remember without surrendering to grief. Because Paris, more than any other city, understands the truth of war. That light means nothing until you've lived without it.